Hello, my name is Omar Al-Ansari Krieger. I represent the Internationalist Academic Federation of the Continental Collective, and this is actually my first occasion consolidating a video publication and airing it on the World Wide Web, so bear with me here for a little bit if I happen to stumble over my words and say, for example, if my transitions of thought are not very thorough. But this week's topic of discussion is going to be internationalism. Now, when we think about internationalism, there are a wide variety of different subject concentrations that come into mind when we basically consider its definitive meaning to us in an academic context, or say just from a general point of perception. However, if we are to thoroughly understand the initial concept behind internationalism, we essentially need to pry into its definitive nature. Now, internationalism, the term itself, is essentially quite self-explanatory when we actually take a look at it from the face value before we even make an effort to look the term up in the dictionary in itself. Now, internationalism essentially implies a type of coercion, a type of union that takes on a very worldly nature that essentially does not necessarily confine itself to a particular guise of sovereignty, to a particular guise of nationalism. However, all of these consistencies essentially illuminate to its initial fundamental ideal. Now, when we actually look at the paradox of internationalism, we must essentially understand its essential rise to affluence in the world spectrum of academia, of international affairs, because essentially we can agree, or points to differentiate, that its initial concept is relatively revolutionary. We see a strong sensational point from the previous century, immediately after the First World War, with the formation of the League of Nations. This historical incident in itself, represents a profound advancement towards the step of internationalism that was essentially founded through a series of mutual protocols that sought to essentially preserve mutual interests in an effort to keep a balance of relative equilibrium, and essentially every academic subject matter, as well as every principle in our physical universe, all diverges on a single principle, which is equilibrium all on its own. So internationalism essentially capitalizes on such a concept, keeping everything in equilibrium, taking on an internationalist form of life, and essentially rectifying a union that derives from all over the world, not necessarily confining itself to one territorial boundary. Now, having defined the initial protocol and definitive nature of internationalism, if you will, we can essentially pry into the imperative nature of ideology. Now, there are a series of different ideologies that were rectified throughout that saw a surge of momentum in the previous century, that were actually rectified and consolidated in the 19th century, the 18th century, what have you. In particular, one concept that sticks out is the philosophy of Marxism. Now, Marxism, in order to truly fundamentally flourish to its manifesto indoctrination, suggests that a worldwide revolution of the proletariat must take place in order for the highest degree of communism to have achieved, and that goes into the withering away of the state. And essentially, this fundamental paradox illuminates towards an internationalist internationalist ideal. However, most forms of socialism, most forms of different philosophies of communism take on this particular guise of publicity, if you will. However, and essentially this only basically reinforces, or it just serves as a common base of reiteration of the imperative nature in which ideology plays into the initial concept of internationalism. Essentially, you need to have a particular ideology to have a concept of internationalism, and depending upon the ideology of observance, it will basically differentiate or rectify a different particular guise of internationalism. Now, hopefully I got someone with that. Bear with me if you didn't. I'll check the comment section later. And my third point that I want to mention on is the initial trends of information technology that continue to so infamously revolutionize the way how we all seem to conduct our human endeavors on a day-to-day basis, whether that's simply driving our car, exchanging basically text messages with each other on a daily basis. This is all a phenomenon of the age of information technology. However, all of these splendors that have been rectified as a result only provides even greater, degrees of pathos for the initial rectification, for more elevated standpoints that are more credible before a public audience, that essentially publicize the concepts of internationalism, going hand in hand with the technological advancements of society. So, and our essential one idea that I would like to take a look at in particular is the concept of the internet. The internet virtually has no sovereign boundaries. We are not confined by sovereignty. We don't need a visa to go in and send an individual or even chat with an individual. Say, I'm here in the United States and I want to chat with an individual in the Russian Federation. I don't need a visa to do that. I don't need permission from his host government to do that. This in itself represents a profound miracle, in which was almost inconceivable 50, 40 years ago among the public mainstream. Just imagine the technology we'll have in the relative future. However, it's only this paradox that must essentially serve for the betterment of mankind. Obviously, the internet can be used for extremely wonderful academic things and extremely horrible and deplorable things. Details I care not to get into. However, this essentially draws into further concept of the resources in which we can all mutually pool for basically the elevation of internationalism. However, throughout this entire video, I've basically been speaking about internationalism in a very broad context. As I had mentioned before, internationalism can vary on its particular ideological protocol. However, it takes on a specific mutual form of life, which is basically favoring an international union. Now, one thing that I would essentially like to highlight to a significant degree or concentration is that every human being, no matter how technologically advanced we are, no matter how much of a surge we have in information technology, we will always have our base of sovereignty. We will always have our individual points of identity, and no one will be able to take that away from us. Now, an example that demonstrates this protocol is we can take a look at the Soviet Union. Going hand in hand with the ideals of Marxism, the Soviet Union in itself was formulated on a basis of internationalism, on a basis of serenity, surrendering your individual nationalistic creed to conform to the designated status quo. Now, obviously, the Soviet state experiment had failed miserably, in which we are still seeing the repercussions in the immediate present at the dawn of the 21st century. However, that has basically highlighted a very turbulent era in which, obviously, an extreme form of internationalism that does absolutely no benefit to the individual, citizenry, in an attempt to completely silence, basically, internationalist or nationalistic identities, basically demonstrates a way that capitulates internationalism, if that makes sense. But obviously, we need our identities, we need our interpersonal points of view. These must remain autonomous, and internationalism, as I mentioned, exists as a universal ideal that is essentially interchangeable, but just subject to its ideological variation. And we have information technology that alleviates our ability to completely communicate throughout vast boundaries, and we have essentially an ability to communicate with every single sovereign. I'm sorry, as I had forewarned you before, we have the ability to communicate with individuals throughout the world, and in itself, this should be a single point of realization that demonstrates such a profound miracle that can only work for the betterment of mankind. Anyway, the Internationalist Academic Federation of the Continental Collective, and its initial designation takes on a worldly form, and basically, that is my spiel for this week, and I would really appreciate any comments and